Good evening and welcome everybody. Welcome to today's talk with authors of Against Abandonment, Repertoires of Solidarity, South Korean Protest. My name is Kurt Organista. I'm a professor of social welfare here on campus and director of the ISSI, now that Stephen has decided to retire. And we are proud to sponsor tonight's event along with the Center for Korean Studies. And we are also very appreciative of our co-sponsors, the Departments of Geography and Sociology, the Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies Program, and the Center for Ethnographic Research, which is one of the 8 centers that comes under the umbrella of ISSI. Tonight's event is extra special here at the ISSI because it's the first of our 50th anniversary celebration this year. Yes, you may clap for that. And also because the event features 2 alumni of the Institute, Jennifer Chun and Judy to my left here. Professors Chun and Han are superb examples of social change scholars that we regularly fund, mentor, and support at the ISSI. And now I'll turn it over to Stephen Lee, Associate Professor of English, Chair of the Center for Korean Studies, to introduce our speakers and tell you more about this.
Well, thank you, Kurt. And I previous to serving as chair of CKS, I was interim chair of ARC, which was under ISSI, and so it's great to be working with ISSI on this wonderful event. And I'd like to thank Deborah and Max. It's great to see you, Stephen.
Good to see you.
For organizing this event, and I look forward to future partnerships with between CKS and ISSI. Today, Jennifer, Jihye Chun, and Judy will discuss their new book, Against Abandonment, Repertoires of Solidarity in South Korean Protest. As you'll see, their very timely book illuminates recent events in South Korea and has broad implications for other countries as well. After their presentation, we will have time for Q&A moderated by Kurt. For those of you joining us via Zoom, please use the Q&A feature to write in your questions, and Kurt will ask those on your behalf. And if I could ask everyone to please silence your cell phones right now, that would be great. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Thank you so much for making the trip, even though the weather has not been great. And by the way, thank you all of you for joining us both in person and online. Jennifer Jihye Chun is Professor of Asian American Studies and Labor Studies at UCLA. She is also chair of the Department of Labor Studies and holds a faculty appointment in the International Institute at UCLA. She received her PhD in sociology here at Berkeley. And among her many publications, I want to mention her first book, Organizing at the Margins, The Symbolic Politics of Labor in South Korea and the United States. Judy Han is Associate Professor of Gender Studies at UCLA. Among Professor Han's many publications, I want to mention that they are currently working on a decolonial travel guide to Korea, and also just published another book, Queer Through Lines, Spaces of Queer Activism in South Korea and the Korean Diaspora, which is published open access. Professor Han earned a PhD in geography here at Cal. We are very honored to welcome you back to your graduate institution. Please join me in welcoming Professor Chun and Professor Han.
Thank you so much to Stephen and Kurt. I am starting off the show tonight. I wanted to say how appreciative I am of the Institute for the Study of Social Issues and for the Center for Korean Studies for hosting the talk, especially to Deborah Lustig and Stephen Lee and to Stephen Small, and also my former committee members are here, Jill Howard and Kim Voss. It's coming back here, even though this building wasn't the place where the Center for Korean Studies was. I remember going to so many different talks, and I'm remembering the passing of kind of dear advisors, David Minkus and Michael Buravoy. And also just really feeling, I feel it's really such a privilege to come back and to be here and to share the findings from this second book project that I co-authored with Judy. I am going to begin, and then Judy will follow, and then I'll say a few things at the end. And also, number keeps going up. But anyways, I will ignore not that I will ignore the Zoom world, but anyways, thanks for joining us too. Okay, so when you think about mass protests in South Korea, the epic candlelight mobilizations of recent years may come to mind. And here we see an image of candlelight protesters who immediately took to the streets after then President Yoon Suk-yeol made a short-lived declaration of martial law on December 3rd, December 3rd. This was an ill-fated act described by many as a kind of self-coup, and this image is taken from the New York Times. This next image was taken 8 years prior, on November 5th, 2016. It reflects an aerial view of hundreds of thousands of protesters who filled the streets and squares of downtown Seoul for 6 consecutive months in opposition to then President Park Geun-hye, whose formal impeachment was confirmed the following March. Mass protests have a storied place in the public imagination. Extraordinary displays of people power have brought about historic political victories. So most notably, some of you may know the 1987 June uprising, which effectively ended 4 decades of military dictatorship in South Korea. Protest spectacles like these are also a dynamic source of social and cultural transformation. And I want to just go back to this first slide. Seen really distinctively in the K-pop light sticks and K-pop anthems that really electrified this moment, and probably will in the foreseeable future. And just an aside, this is a phenomena that seems to be single-handedly reviving interest in protest and social movements in Korea for this kind of new generation, which I guess is fortuitous for us. This is the theme of our research for the past decade and a half. But for us, I want to kind of take a step back because, as spectacular and extraordinary as these moments of eventful history are, mass mobilizations are not the only form of protest that matters, nor should they be treated as a kind of sort of pinnacle of popular contention or the kind of end game point. And this is often the case in both the public and scholarly literature on protest. Large-scale public assemblies are one of many different forms that protesters use in the repertoire, and one that we find and argue is not necessarily the primary engine for expressing grievances, targeting opponents, amplifying claims, and forging the kind of solidarity that is crucial to sustaining bitter and protracted fights, like the ones that we've studied over the past decade and a half, especially in a time of rampant inequality, gross injustice, extreme state violence, and institutional harm. So as we argue in this book, if we are going to really try to understand the kinds of protests that matter and that really are taking place all around the world, in varying kind of sizes with various forms to, really variegated ends, we need to shift our lens and look more acutely at these kinds of smaller localized protest forms that often go unseen and noticed as part of a broader repertoire of collective action. And there are many that take place over and over again, some with as few as 1 or 2 protesters and just a handful of witnesses. These are, happened sort of before, during, and long after these kind of epic mass mobilizations in 2016 and 17, and just last year. So I want to point us to one, seemingly inconsequential struggle that happened, a month after Park Geun-hye's her impeachment was formally confirmed and the candlelight protests formally ended. And this is a nearly month-long high-altitude Gwanghwamun billboard occupation protest. Essentially, 6 workers from 6 different unions climbed 40 meters high to the top of this 10-story building. And you see like think it's a QLED TV, LED billboard. On the top of that, on your left-hand side, you'll see this banner, which essentially just says protect the three basic rights of workers. And they and this was named the Gwanghwamun Exit 7 high altitude occupation protest because it's located right next to the Gwanghwamun subway station where there's a lot of foot traffic. And these protesters confined themselves to a cramped and exposed area beneath this massive billboard without access to adequate food, water, shelter, or sanitation. And, if we look at the square, I just want to kind of look here. You can see that this building is actually right there, right there. And so down here is where you see it's the southeast corner of the square. This high altitude protest took place up above, and down below we see this ground level solidarity encampment, which is where the entire time during this nearly month-long high-altitude occupation to really sort of alert people of kind of the protesters up above. Now, even though this protest it didn't seem to sort of garner much attention, especially as candlelight protesters are celebrating their jubilant victory. It was striking to us for the vivid kind of memories and scenes it left with us as we left the field and we were thinking about how to make sense of our year in the field. And I think, we write about this at the start of chapter 2, but after the last day at this protest press conference, where each and every worker was slowly sort of accompanied down the stairs and rushed in ambulances to the nearby Green Hospital, Judy and I went to a nearby cafe to just sort of decompress. And what was kind of, really sort of mesmerizing about the scene that unfolded was that we watched kind of a group of workers in union vests get out of a van and methodically and expertly pack up this farm level encampment, right? Folding tarps, cleaning up debris, and they left as if nothing sort of happened. And this protest actually sort of ended kind of, I guess, ostensibly in defeat, because they really, one of their main strategies was to get KCTU, the Peak Labor Confederation, to pay attention to the struggles of precarious or irregularly employed workers, and that didn't actually happen. So another vivid example are grueling protest acts, such as slow-moving Oche-Tuji processions, and this is what you see in these two images. And Oche-Tuji is essentially kind of the word for when 5 points of your body face the ground in full prostration, and it's a Tibetan Buddhist ritual. So Yusung workers that worked for a subcontractor making auto manufacturing parts actually did this procession at the height of the 2016 and 2000 candlelight protests, and you can see that they're nearby City Hall. And what they directly referenced at this time was the 2014 Oche-Tuji protest by Kiryong Electronics assembly workers, which was even more brutal. It was 5 days long, it took place in the bitter kind of winter cold, where they essentially became sort of covered in soot and snow. What these and many other examples that we discuss in the book, when we think about these, what we want to emphasize is that, taken together, what these protest repertoires depict, it's as much about drama and spectacle as they are about sacrifice and suffering. The protest forms we chronicle, primarily by workers in precarious or irregular jobs who are our main protagonists in the book, but also displaced residents, elderly, grandmothers, bereaved parents, disability rights, and queer, LGBTQ plus or sexually minority activists, ones that Judy followed more closely in her book, Queer Through Lines. These protests are punishing to perform and agonizing to witness. Yet their political affects are catalytic. And so in studying these protest repertoires, what we want to emphasize is that how we study the repertoire matters, as well as what it does to forge connection and solidarity. We focus on the doing and feeling of protest, not just to gain a better understanding of why people protest, but how and under what conditions protesters enact and sustain their struggles, often against all odds, and typically in the face of severe opposition and retaliation. And, if we were to have a sort of take-home point, kind of a major argument in the book is that when we study protest repertoires, beyond simply sort of making or amplifying claims against targeted opponents, which is, sort of the typical way that protest repertoires are studied in the sociological literature, we find that protest repertoires create relations and spaces of solidarity that connect and reconnect the bodies, sites, and memories of protesters across history and geography. By repeatedly circulating and gaining traction between and among disparate actors, groups, symbols, and places, these seemingly inconsequential forms constitute deeply embodied and place-based repertoires that work through and across place and space and embodiment as conduits of social transformation. They operate, in the words of feminist geographer Doreen Massey, as the, quote, simultaneity of stories so far. And they create relations and spaces of solidarity out of, quote, multiplicity, antagonisms, and contrasting temporalities, to borrow again from Massey. So in a nutshell, what we're trying to sort of convey in the book is that protest repertoires are in fact really contradictory, ambivalent, and affectively charged spaces. We'll see joy and celebration, but we'll also see grief and mourning, and frustration and disappointment, and anger and indignation. And these protest repertoires hold all of these affective and emotional intensities together in ways that sometimes can actually drain a social movement of all of its energy, but in other times, under certain conditions, can actually be redeployed, channeled in ways that actually produce meaningful relations and connections that then become repeatedly performed over time and space. So this is something that Judy will talk about in more detail as she goes deeper into our cases. What I want to do is just give a sense of the book as a whole. Since, it's actually really challenging to give book talks. This is now like the fourth or fifth time, and each time it's completely different, which doesn't feel like a labor-saving strategy, but in some ways, I think, to try to kind of give a sense of the book as a whole, kind of in one sitting, reminds us that, that's the reason you write a book. You can't talk about everything, but what is it that's in here, since I will undoubtedly miss things. So our introduction, Life and Death Protest, really lays out the driving questions that animate, as I said, really decades-long ethnographic research on the protest repertoires of labor and social movement activists since the mid-2000s. And, we chronicle the long-term struggles of workers, women, and other minoritized groups who have been spearheading these grueling battles that last months and sometimes years with no end in sight. And this actually profoundly puzzled us. And so one of the kind of, through line questions throughout the entire book is why, in the face of misrecognition, abjection, and failure, do protesters continue to protest, and often in more desperate registers? And this is not a question that is well researched in the social science literature on protests and social movements. Yet, to understand protests that seemingly defy reason, we needed to actually find some theoretical frameworks that helped us understand our cases. Because in some ways, when I first, started studying these protests, when we first started studying these protests in the mid-2000s, they seemed like an aberration, right? But in 2017, 18, 19, 20, and still ongoing, we know now that they're not an aberration. They're very much an entrenched part of the repertoire. So to try to figure out why, we turn to interdisciplinary studies, particularly in performance studies, most notably in the work of Diana Taylor, to really give us a sense of how to make sense of these embodied place-based repertoires. And we talk a lot about the importance of theorizing repertoires as both performative and ritualized, and that's the subject of chapter 2. Chapter 1, before that, gives crucial context for why these protest forms have become so prevalent, over the past decade and a half, particularly among our main protagonists, precariously employed workers. And I'll talk a little bit about precarity. But 3, 4, and 5, which are sort of the more of the empirical kind of case discussions, point us to the attention of keywords. So we look at protest repertoires and solidarity in terms of affect in chapter 3, care and infrastructure in chapter 4, and as transformative processes of placemaking in chapter 5. And so we'll have sort of more kind of photos to give you a sense of this kind of visual and affective landscape. But I did note that I wanted to just provide a bit of context about how to understand precarity in South Korea, to give you a sense of what people are fighting both against and amidst. Okay, so for those who are not familiar with South Korea, labor precarity is often associated. So the guiding question of this chapter is to try to understand labor precarity. And what people have sort of argued has now become the new normal in South Korea. But through these protests, we put a sort of question mark there, because this is precisely the dynamic that many workers, but also other supporters and other social movement groups have been innovating the protest form to highlight. For those who are not familiar with South Korea, so labor precarity is often associated with the 1990s, right? The post-authoritarian period of democratic transformation, when neoliberalism and globalization so-called opened up the national economy to transnational trade, foreign capital, marketization. Labor market flexibility was central to the reigning economic orthodoxy at the time, especially after the country's massive economic bailout loan from the International Monetary Fund in 1997, which many describe as initiating this new period of low road strategies, and many have talked about it in the sense of replacing sort of formal employment that's full-time and secure with these precarious forms of irregular employment that are essentially excluded from existing labor and social protection. But really, many people in the literature have taken issue with this periodization, right? Including kind of people in this room, especially when situated from the global south, right? Who argue that the labor market has always been informal and precarious in many post-colonial countries. And in South Korea, this was definitely the case during the kind of so-called takeoff in industrial diversification that's associated with Korea's compressed industrialization in the 1960s and 1970s going up to the 1980s. Nevertheless, whether we sort of debate, the origins of precarity, what we find is that precarity is become quite a central keyword. In fact, precarity and inequality are kind of very popular keywords, especially because of the expansion of the culture industry. I don't know if you guys saw Parasite and Squid Game, the Netflix blockbuster and the Oscar award-winning film. I actually delayed seeing Squid Game for a time. I'm not into sort of torturous kinds of things, but when I watched it, it made sense, right? Because this Squid Game, for example, is based on sort of a reading of the Sangyeong auto workers factory lockdown. And so you sort of have this you have sort of the connections between the brutal disposability and abandonment that workers and other people that are part of the kind of the urban and working class poor experience because of the kind of social and economic transformations at the time. And so, for example, a Squid Game is often described as an allegory of capitalist hell. Parasite, like Squid Game, dramatizes the horrors of modern inequality and exploitation in South Korea, right? Shredding the capitalist myth that hard work guarantees prosperity. Inequality in South Korea is really been escalating over the past 2 decades, and especially long after the official end of the country's financial crisis. The country is plagued with remarkable inequality, debilitating consumer and household debt, and persistent urban and working class poverty. And here you can see some of this breakdown, right? Still some of the world's longest working hours, despite the fact that it's a major economic powerhouse in the global economy. It has the highest suicide rate in the OECD. The Global Gender Gap reported that Korea ranks 101 out of 148 countries on the Gender Inequality Index. And, even though precarious employment as a sort of economic phenomena has tapered off. And in fact, recent reports show that only about 40% of the workforce is employed in precarious jobs. The kind of intersectional or gendered inequality that describes this experience of everyday precarity is pronounced, and women are disproportionately employed in precarious jobs. And what precarious jobs means in the South Korean labor market is that you often do the same or similar work for just a little more than half the pay, and little to no job security, and extreme vulnerability to sort of employer arbitrary practices. So in spite or perhaps because of these injunctive conditions, we've seen a tremendous pushback against the normalization of precarity as a way of life. And this is a feat that we found really should be attributed to the struggles of precarious workers, which is why they feature so prominently in our book about Repertoires of Solidarity. So I wanted to share a quote by Kim Hye-jin, a longtime labor and social movement activist that has supported, many of these protest forms by precarious workers since the early 2000s, to give us a sense of what these types of protests do to change kind of the public imagination and national lexicon when it comes to precarity. She says, quote, "Workers have shown us why precarious employment is wrong, and why it is a problem that as a society on the whole we need to address. When precarious workers engage in extreme forms of struggle, like high altitude occupations, the occupation of stores and workplaces, and hunger strikes, their fights make the issue visible. In this respect, it is an important and valuable achievement that we have public consensus that precarious work should not be normal." And in this, the final point I want to make about precarity before handing it over to Judy is that we theorize precarity as not just an objective condition in the changing world of work, right? We theorize precarity as a political concept that has been politicized by the struggles of these workers to really reveal, what's at stake when workers get fired by text messages en masse after working 10 years in a single workplace, or when they're promised, they're sort of dangled the promise of formal sector employment and job security, even as the law dictates, and they've won repeated court cases and institutional rulings, only to have that factory shut down and abscond with no financial or legal accountability. Okay, so with that, I want to turn it over to Judy to share some of our ethnographic cases.
I would like to focus on the ideas of the protest repertoire and introduce you to some of the key interlocutors in our book. Kim Hye-jin is one of them, and KTX workers are actually another group of workers we write quite a lot about. KTX Crew Workers Union. This is a picture, a news photo from a press conference announcing the end of their 12-year struggle. 4,526. And that means somebody was counting. This was at the entrance of the Seoul Central Station, and it was the summer of 2018 when the union was finally able to negotiate a collective agreement with the Korea Railroad Corporation, with 180 women workers reinstated and hired as workers. 12 years they fought. And we were there actually when they first started, back in 2006-ish. They were known as flight attendants underground, the train attendant. They were college educated. These were highly competitive positions. And KTX workers were in many ways very unlikely to be protagonists of a long protracted organized labor struggle, which is typically known for its militancy and masculinity. We had first learned about the KTX workers through their direct actions like this in 2006, when the striking workers, train attendants, tied themselves in rope, with rope to each other while wearing matching form-fitting uniforms consisting of gray skirt suits and bright multicolor neck scarves. You might recognize them as similar to, say, Korean airline uniforms. And in subsequent years, over the course of their long, protracted fight, they did everything. And in fact, that was something that we heard over and over again when we talked to workers in a lot of these protracted struggles. Many of them literally said, we did everything but die. So that's part of this whole idea of protest repertoires too. Nobody does just one protest form. Nobody does just one rally or one hunger strike and expect to for that to work. In fact, most of these protracted struggles, especially for those that go on for this long, we're talking about a series of protest forms over and over again, sometimes innovating and sometimes repeating. The KTX unionists engaged in everything from confrontational direct action to the symbolic protest actions, and occupation of public spaces to holding head-shaving ceremonies and prayer protests. And it became clear to us throughout this research that one does not engage in a single one-off protest. There is a repertoire. Performance studies scholar Diana Taylor writes that regardless of how well-developed the repertoire is, or how many times a familiar act or scene is repeated, the outcome of any given performance is never fixed or predetermined. She argues that the performative power of a repertoire to move people occurs through reactivation rather than duplication. And indeed, our primary focus in the book concerns the relational processes that are activated and reactivated between protesters and supporters, between one protest act to the next, between witnesses and participants engaged in these protests. And at its core, the word repertoire means a lot of things, but it means a list of things that can be found again or produced again, not only as in a set of songs, dances, or protests, but also any set of repeatable practices that can be performed and re-performed, enacted and reenacted, but never in an identical manner. That's the script, right? The protest repertoire endures by being enacted again and again, and each iteration is repeatable, but never identical. But what they do, we find, is that they link past and present through embodiment, through embodied practice. Protesters in our book actively draw connections to each other through their participation in these protest repertoires, in these shared protest repertoires, and they insist on repetition and historical continuity as lifelines. They refuse to abandon each other. They enact a commitment to proliferate and thicken the web of solidarity through their participation in these protests. And in fact, many of these protests, there's a very explicit reference and citation of other struggles who have engaged in that similar protest act. Jenny's already talked a little bit, and this is the cover image from our book, The High Altitude Protest. And this protest repertoire is a well-known one, and it's become actually very common, with hundreds of them taking place since 1990. These are workers and protesters occupying everything from cable towers to bridges to rooftops and church towers, bell towers, to rooftops of factories. construction cranes, of course, being the most famous one. Thanks. I think I actually have the next slide. It's the construction crane. Yeah, thanks. And the Kim Jin-suk really, sort of put this form on the radar in 2011 with their 309-day occupation, living on top of the construction crane. But like I said, hundreds of similar occupation of different structures, but at the high altitude the prostrations have taken place since 1990s, but really the 2000s, especially around after Kim Jin-suk. And in August 2025, so just last year, just a few months ago, a new record was set by a worker who occupied a rooftop of a factory that shut down after a fire, breaking the previous record of 408 days that was set in 2015. The new record set by Park Jung-hye at Korea Optical High Tech is 600 days. She lived alone on the rooftop for 600 days, and it is a record that no one is proud of, and no one should have to fight like this to endure so much. That is the sentiment in the movement, and yet the repertoires get repeated and the records get broken. But a different kind of protest we look at. So if high altitude protests are really about isolation and sort of the verticality of the protest form, in chapter 3, we have a section titled Where Protesters Sleep. And we discuss in particular the work of an activist photographer, Jung Tae-kyung, whose photos appear throughout our book, who in 2016 published a collection of photography that includes this photo. And it's an aerial view of the striking KTX train attendants taken in 2006, just 2 months after initially the 350 workers were fired via text for forming a union and initiating a strike. And you see them gathered in a cordoned-off section of a busy terminal inside the Seoul train station, and the young female KTX unionists, alongside fellow unionists from the Korean Railroad Workers Union, are scattered across seat cushions and floor mats, enclosed by union banners and protest signs. And in the photo, they're talking, they're eating, and a few are on the floor in sleeping positions. I mentioned the sleeping because dwelling for months in makeshift shelters or indefinitely occupying public places requires creative and resourceful negotiations with the environments in which protesters find themselves. This includes figuring out how, when, and where to eat, wash, access toilets, where to rest, play, and sleep under conditions of uncertainty, shortage, conflict, and threats of violence. It also involves reorganizing spaces and facilities in ways that support the basic needs of communal living, even when not designed to do so. And protesters involved in long-term encampments, and in fact, some of our fondest memories, I think, or at least for me, are visiting the interior spaces of encampment tents. And some of them are like elaborate, right? They have all kinds of, anyways, you can imagine the range of encampment spaces. They rely heavily on disposable and easily transportable objects. And in fact, we heard that the advances in camping equipment actually also really helped with long-term encampments. So North Face came up a lot, ironically. The cooking and cleaning outdoors, the designation of separate spaces for rest and medical care. And even in this photo, you see the separation. I don't know if you see the line of shoes, sort of demarcating indoor space and outdoor space. Even within the encampment space, this is also really common. The social media and group text platforms and relationships with adjacent businesses play a crucial role in helping protesters defend themselves against the constant threat of removal and the destruction of their belongings by police and privately hired security guards. In the spring and summer of 2017, when we met with the key KTX union leaders in Seoul, we had a rare lighthearted moment looking back at some of their protest encampment experiences. And this is a photo by the same photographer in his book. And they remembered this moment, they remembered these experiences and of living together and protesting together in close quarters during these occupation protests, many of them becoming close friends. And the word in Korean, 농성, the encampment, enacts a very particular kind of a spatial relation of attachment and belonging. The KTX union leader Kim Seung-ha recalled, and this is a quote. She says, "You know how men always talk about their military service? You know, if you know. If you know, you know." She says, "We always talk about the encampment experience. 3 years. It really was almost like military service. We say that when we went to the military, and not only that, we pulled off special ops. We learned to form teams and disperse to avoid the police, and we knew how to enter enemy territory in 3s and 4s and gather somewhere at a certain time, ditching the plainclothes cops who followed us everywhere. We were able to assemble in a flash and pull off an occupation in minutes." And one of the more lighthearted moments involved the women's nighttime skincare regimens, as you see in this photo. "I'm sure this is not a common scene at a protest camp," laughed a worker we talked to, who added, "but however much we have to protest, we have to also take care of our skin." And this was not a joke to her, because skincare was about work ethic. She said, as a matter of fact, "The reason why we bothered to do face masks was because we thought we could be reinstated at any moment. We wanted to be ready to start work again, which meant we had to maintain our appearance." But their fight for reinstatement went on for over 12 years, and one of the KTX workers' final protest actions was an Oche Tuji, a slow-moving and painstaking procession influenced by Tibetan Buddhist rituals of prostration. And as Jenny mentioned, it's a procession that compels individual participants to throw 5 points of their body onto the ground, including both knees, both elbows, and their forehead, in a full horizontal spread before getting up again and repeating the slow-moving procession. They direct our attention to the spectacle of bodies crawling on the ground. KTX unionists performed nearly 2.5 miles of Oche Tuji in near freezing temperature just before they concluded their fight. And a few years before that, in December 2014, laid-off Kyung electronics workers also performed an Oche Tuji. And as Jenny mentioned, there's an earlier photo of them as well. It was a 5-day long, nearly 10 miles of Oche Tuji on snow-covered streets of Seoul to mark the end of their decade-long fight. And I actually have a short video. There's actually a you can actually get this as even without the audio. I'll actually talk through it. So the Buddhist prostration protests like Oche Tuji reflect dramatic and highly ritualized aspects of Korean workers' contemporary protest repertoires. As you can see, they subject one's body and mind to grueling conditions, turning an ordinary march. After all, it is just a walk, so to speak, but it's a slow-moving and physically strenuous procession. And when performing Oche Tuji, protesters make their way across space, whether on congested urban streets or along the side of a roadway in the rural countryside. They typically wear matching minbok, a traditional Korean peasant's clothing in all white, which progressively turns brown and black with all kinds of dark and dry, falling onto streets over the course of hours and days. And by engaging in such painstaking, slow, and grueling motion, protesters create religiously inflected spectacles of discipline and devotion. Thank you. As protest performance, Oche Tuji draws attention on the body, draws our attention to the body and the ground as spaces of vulnerability and exposure. It juxtaposes the slow time of ritual with the accelerated pace of economic development and urban transformation. And the stirring scenes produced by Oche Tuji protests remind bystanders and passersby that confronting powerful opponents entails sacrifices and suffering. But in our interview, Jihye, who's on top of that tower in the cover of her book, stressed that Oche Tuji fosters self-reflection and subject formation, and that it is not simply instrumental for making appeals to public sympathy. She really focused on the interior experiences. And in fact, what she said was, stayed with us for a long time. She said, you don't do Oche Tuji to keep falling on the ground. You do it to keep getting up. The case of KTX train attendants and Kiryung electronics workers involves struggles led by 당사자 workers. And this is also a really key term in our book, a term that refers to directly impacted persons in a dispute or grievance, 당사자. And this distinction actually matters quite a lot. There are important interactional dynamics between 당사자 and external allies and supporters that shape the performative and ritualized aspect of protest repertoires. There's an important distinction. Since the 1990s, the precarious workers have embraced their role as 당사자, or the most directly impacted protagonists of their own fights, demanding fair wages, demanding their jobs back, and so on. But one of our key interlocutors, Sister Maria, is a Catholic nun and not a 당사자, and she represents a different part of this of the vibrant protest landscape. In fact, Sister Maria would constitute part of a distinct solidarity activism that emerges in the 2000s, one that recognizes the political character of injustice and suffering and seeks to form alliances among the most directly impacted 당사자 and their supporters, advocates, and other solidarity groups in order to collectively organize to alleviate the harm and seek recourse. Sister Maria is featured prominently in chapter 4 of our book on caring infrastructure, in which we discuss the paradoxical nature of solidarity, in that the power of solidarity must be visible to move publics, and yet the work involved in creating solidaristic collectivities is often most effective when unseen and unnoticed as part of the infrastructure of social movement praxis. Sister Maria, and she chose that name with, it was very tongue-in-cheek because this is apparently also a name that many Catholic nuns used. They were all Marias, basically. When questioned about their identity, they were Maria, 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 Maria. So that kind of anonymity was also part of their protective cover. And Sister Maria and her colleagues, dressed in similar, but not identical, we've learned, not identical gray veils and plain tunics, perform a broad range of organizing activities that are vital to sustaining several key struggles throughout South Korea, completing everything from daily chores to fundraisers and essential tasks. They quietly help coordinate the flow of solidarity caravans in and out of protest sites. They take care of physical and psychological well-being of beleaguered and battered protesters. They're there when other solidarity activists get tired and go home. They respond to urgent publicity and fundraising needs, helping maintain a steady flow of resources and information between protesters and supporters. They do all kinds of things, the Catholic nuns. And activist nuns, as in many places, are known for standing courageously also alongside protesters in particularly volatile situations and confronting police by asserting their presence in a show of religious solidarity, dignity, and perseverance. And in important ways, the nuns' steadfast solidarity provide a kind of protective accompaniment, which put bodies that are less at risk next to bodies that are under threat. And as the logic of accompaniment goes, the police might not hesitate to push aside a poor, uneducated, and elderly farmer without political clout or social standing, but they just might pause before using force against the Catholic nun. And something we found especially illuminating were the in-between processes of becoming visible and becoming invisible. So not just between visible and invisible, but the becoming processes. The relational processes that Sister Maria and other activist organizers constantly negotiated to ensure that 당사자 protest actors, those most directly impacted by an injustice, remained front and center as the protagonists of a fight, and external allies remain part of the quiet organizing going on in the shadows. One story stands out to me as especially memorable, and as you can imagine, there were a lot of stories in this research. And that was about the Catholic nuns' solidarity work to support elderly villagers who were fighting dispossession and displacement in the remote mountain area called Miryang, in the photo from that struggle, due to electrical infrastructure construction. And the elderly women in Miryang, this was a really militant struggle, and the elderly women organized a daily protest every morning at the protest camp for several years. And activist nuns like Sister Maria joined them in solidarity every day. This meant that the nuns left their convents long before sunrise, sometimes as early as 3 o'clock in the morning, even before the trains and buses start running. And Sister Maria and other resourceful nuns convinced their priests, the convents, to allow them to use church vans as part of this commute. But still, there was a great deal of walking that had to be done. Sister Maria recounted this vividly and quietly, that at the heart of her work to support the villagers of Midang was the power of corporeal co-presence. She remembered the cold walks in pre-dawn darkness, encountering along the way other nuns in their habits, walking quietly toward the protest encampment. Quietly and together, they would walk with determination and resolve. And she was emphatic about the value of persistent presence. Showing up time and time again and maintaining a presence was a deeply intentional practice of solidarity. The nuns' attentiveness to individuals in need of care and their willingness and capacity to provide care, this was undoubtedly gendered labor of social reproduction. As women, the nuns typically worked alongside other women whose social locations as mothers, wives, and daughters put them at the center of gendered reproductive labor, or at least in very close proximity. And what Sister Maria clarified for our research was that her and other Catholic nuns' solidarity work, as well as many other solidarity activists and their work, must be understood on multiple registers. They're part of a broader network of solidarity, in this case, religious solidarity. But unlike some that take on more symbolic significance, the nuns, who, by the way, are also at the bottom of the Catholic hierarchy and not ordained as clergy, they participate in struggles against alienation and abandonment, primarily by performing reproductive labor and essential care work. A recurring emphasis on process and relationality rather than simply on goals and outcomes. This is crucial for us in understanding how reflexive social movements contend with the dominance of neoliberal logics, tyranny, and precarity. Importantly, it's women workers in South Korea who experience disproportionate rates of precarious employment and workplace discrimination, who experience deep-seated gender equality and misogyny at their workplace and at home, who have led some of the longest and hardest fought struggles in South Korean history. KTX workers, Gideon electronics workers, Sister Maria, and so many others in our research demonstrate the critical importance of multi-scalar care work involved in activism, not only to reinforce and reproduce movement infrastructures, but also to reimagine and revise movement practices. To repeat, solidarity is not merely an outcome or a strategic posture, but a catalytic force, creating forms of being together that push against abandonment, that refuse neoliberalized precariousness. Just going to say a couple more things about solidarity.
So I just want to wrap up with a couple slides. So in conclusion, so like many, we finished the concluding chapter shortly before submitting the book for submitting the final manuscript for production. And it was difficult to conclude a book that took actually a really long time to write together. I mean, there's actually many reasons why it took so long, but also just to make sense of all this complexity. We actually had fights. I wanted boxes and tables. She can fix them. Anyways, but as we talked about our findings with different audiences, we were struck by how often people asked us about failure. Even after sort of giving talks and recounting all the ways that these protest forms matter and the difference they make, people often came back with the question, why do people engage in such extreme and desperate acts when they're bound to fail? So we began our conclusion by taking this problematic head on. And as Kim Voss has noted in her work on the Knights of Labor, failure is actually quite an unpopular and uncomfortable topic among social movement scholars, right? If we mention failure, it's like we're diminishing the significance of the protests that we have spent so long studying. This is actually something we encountered sort of most recently when we gave a book forum at the International Sociology Association, when sort of we were asked, why do we keep talking about failure when there are actually lots of achievements? And I want to talk about those achievements. But I think it's really crucial to give that context. And sort of to take a spin from Audra Simpson and other scholars of colonialism that say like colonialism is not an event, like Patrick Wolf, it's a structure. We see failure not as an event, but as a structure that shapes the horizon of protest and social movement politics over and over again, precisely because of the uneven power geometries, the unequal relations that continue to intensify and take root even when you win. And as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, the day after you win, the struggle begins again, right? To kind of contend with failure. But in doing so, what we also wanted to talk about is what working through failure, pushing back against it, pushing through actually achieves. And, this is really just a summary of the key points that Judy made when talking about these different protest forms. We conceptualize solidarity not just as static notions of sameness, like-mindedness, and unity that are often assumed to be kind of the form that solidarity takes, especially in these mega protests. We emphasize solidarity as a catalytic force, right? Performed over and over again through reactivation rather than simply duplication. These extraordinary acts of protest cannot be sustained without mutual aid and support. And this is really crucial, right? Solidarity is not just ideological. It's not just a state of mind. It's not just a pronouncement of unity. It takes work to sustain the life of protest and protesters throughout these long, protracted battles, whether in Korea or elsewhere. And the effective politics of solidarity are pragmatic and essential, as well as transformative, right? Through the relational processes of co-presence and care that really are shot through supporting these different protest forms. So, to end, we turn to Mariam Kaba and Let This Radicalize You for a quote on hope. And she says, and she's a transformative justice, abolitionist scholar and sociologist who says, quote, "For me, hope is not a metaphor. It's a lived practice. It isn't a thing I possess. Rather, I have to remake it daily. I don't have hope. I do hope. Hope not as an emotion, but as a discipline. Hope to me is grounded in the reality that wondrous things happen alongside and parallel to the parable every single day." And, we wanted to leave you with this final point about hope, because we often get accused of writing a hopeful book. And I don't know why I take that as a criticism, but somehow I do. But if we think about hope as a discipline, it really changes the way that we think about the centrality of hope and the limits and political possibilities that these protests produce. Today, hope as a discipline is something that's talked about quite a lot in many, many different social movement circles, right? And especially now as we're dealing with ICE raids, police murders over, long periods of time, people who are being disappeared. We're kind of seeing neo-fascism and tyranny right here in our own backyards. Thinking about hope as a discipline and thinking about the connections and the crucial conversations that people are having every day about how to persist, survive, and meet the next day to us seem like an important achievement of these protests. Okay, so thank you.
Okay, I'm so impressed by all this repertoire of localized extreme actions. I'm from Japan, where social movements are very, very low key and not really standing out. I always think about Korea. How is it possible in Korea this kind of things happen? Now I learned you have all this very radical action supported by many workers as well as citizens continue everywhere. How is it possible? Something behind all these actions, society, economy, people's socialization, say Singapore and Japan, very similar in a way, very autocratic society. This doesn't happen. How is it possible? This is a very simple question in response to your presentation. from East Asia?
Well, I think, one really important characteristic of this kind of protest repertoire is the fact that there is tremendous organizational capacity in Korea. So not just by organized labor, when you talk to people in the union movement, they are, not just sort of mobilizing people onto the streets for the intermittent strike or sort of taking vote. They really are places of assembly, of support, of cultural, solidarity. They have vans, they have megaphones, they have blankets in their offices. So, with every union, with every democratic union that sort of fought and created what were created and kind of different arenas, comes this kind of organizational know-how, which we talk a lot about in the book. But it's not just unions, it's different social movement organizations. And, one thing that we learned about organizing is that there is so much social movement know-how that have been developed precisely because these forms are quite, in many cases, quite grueling. And even when they're not grueling, preparing programs, organizing guest speakers, cleaning up spaces, registering for permits, coordinating with the police, there's tremendous organizational capacity that gets developed among volunteer activists as well as some paid activists. So that kind of organizational structure that we talk about, especially in chapter 5, we talk about the candlelight protests. And people talk about, this is the internet age, it's social media, like people can sort of text and everyone will show up. But if you participate in those protests, you have like massive construction cranes holding mega speakers that the KCTU and other peak social movement organizations have paid for. You have like kind of these stages that are built and assembled by a combination of volunteer and paid labor. So you have so much of this that's happening. And so kind of preparing the ground for these struggles has also developed kind of civil society and organizational capacity in a way that I think is quite distinctive. But maybe one other point, unless Judy has something to say, there's also kind of unexpected reason, like especially during the 2016-17 candlelight protests, we laugh because, when 1 million people assemble in the historic streets and squares of Seoul, like everyone has to go to the bathroom, everyone has to eat, so like, basically the high-tech public transportation system, the fact that a lot of buildings, even if they're not public, are mandated to have public restrooms, sort of the use of space over and over again. And that's what we talk, the transformation of space and people's sort of demands through kind of the post-authoritarian civil society of demanding public access to space. This is also part of what we see has supported this type of social movement life.
Jenny, Judy, we have a question from Jay Lin, who's on Zoom.
Okay.
He says, I wondered whether there were any collective singing, dancing, crafting, or cultural moments at the encampments and how these cultural gatherings further enhance the visibility of the struggling workers.
I knew you were going to look at me for some reason for the singing part. I don't know why. Of course there was singing. Dancing, I'm not sure if I've seen all that much dancing, but singing of movement songs. The two specific things that come to mind. One was very early on that we were part of these union struggles where Elan cashiers, the supermarket cashiers. So women workers who are not necessarily used to this kind of militant, labor union rallies, we saw a process where they're actually being taught, right? And the teaching in that case was not just the lyrics and the songs, but also how to raise their fist a certain way. There's a certain motion that and so you see a lot of these awkward, maybe that's dancing then. So the kind of instructional, the relations that are also forged in these protest spaces. That was very early on, and I'm sure these moments continue. And And actually, in many ways, one of those instances were very recently. So after we finished the book, we went to Korea, wanting nothing to do with protest, and that's when the martial law protests happened. So there was no getting away from protests. But this time it was all K-pop. So the older folks and people who were used to protesting before the current wave of K-pop didn't actually know any of the new protest songs, which was all K-pop. So there was also sort of this like mutual teaching, across generations that took place. So the K-pop, the young folks were learning old movement songs. The old folks were learning K-pop in order to actually participate and transform the space of protest.
But protest spaces are really lively in Korea. There's traditional drumming, there's contemporary drumming, there's traditional singing, there's, K-pop, there's, when I first started doing field work for my dissertation, I joined something called a yuldompe, which I thought I sort of introduced myself as somebody who liked sort of choreography and dance. And I was quickly schooled that this is class struggle, like not dance, because it's a very sort of militaristic thing. Actually, when I went to South Africa, you just run the whole time. You know what I mean? Like you run and you sing, and there's a different sort of affect to that. Whereas in Korea, it's very like, it's very choreographed. Whether it's songs or coordinated movements or other types of things.
This was related to the earlier points about space. So you talk about protests through high altitude and protests through subterranean kind of spaces. When I was in Seoul, one of the things that struck me is every city has these underground and the subways, but in Seoul they seem to extend far longer. I mean, it seems like you could walk a mile underground, and I assume those spaces are being used and utilized for practical purposes, but also for organizational purposes. Is that your experience?
Absolutely. You can't gather 1 million people in downtown and disperse peacefully without any event if you don't have a vibrant and robust transportation infrastructure. So we get a lot of questions about why these protests, or how can we, have organized protests like this in the US or something like that. Let's see. So let's combine all major cities into one. That would be Seoul. Let's have more than half of the country's population, the population live in that city. Have one of the most amazing urban transportation infrastructure that can handle the weight, and on top of it, provide free and accessible restrooms. Then we can get it done. It's a very structuralist response.
One of the longest running, I thought you were going to talk about the disability rights encampments, but one of the longest running protest encampments was in Gwanghwamun Station underground for 10 years. For 10 years. And so if anyone was there were like pink Post-its and and in some ways, what was kind of interesting is when we had sort of interviewed the disability rights activists, they talked about how kind of the subway kind of police would greet them like at the beginning, at the end of the workday, like they were going to work. Like this was it had become so routine. And
they were demanding access to public transportation, which obviously is not accessible.
So I guess first a comment and then a question. So the comment is, like, if I had been at the ISA, right, I might have tried to turn that around and say, sort of, the interesting question is what sustains it, right? So failure is you're looking at one event and it doesn't work, or you're looking at one struggle in it. But this is there's huge sustained struggle. So that's a really interesting question. How can you sustain it? My second question is, Jenny talked about the Knights. So one argument that I make there when I compare in an article after that book, where I compare the Knights to a very similar movement that was happening in England at the same time. And I speculate that in England, one reason why it doesn't die out, like the kind of the same kind of struggle, is because there's an interpretation of the defeat that the Knights just don't do. So you didn't have, I mean, I wasn't there, but it doesn't seem like, there's no discussion in bars afterwards about what went wrong and what will happen the next time that will make it have a different outcome. And that there did seem, when you read the newspapers and accounts of speeches, there was that sort of interpretation going on in the comparative case. So did you see any of that? Like, you have to sort of, to keep that's hope alive. Like, this is why at the end of the day, we will, change the amount of precarity in career or whatever. Did people do that kind of interpretation?
Like assessment, evaluation,
Yes, and
the critical self-reflection, of course.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely.
And
And
so-
at bars and drinking, of course.
Yeah, and but then why it would like a kind of argument about
Yeah.
why we don't give up now because this is on the way to winning.
Yeah.
That solidarity poster that they had where they would have like the heartbeat of every protest and then it all led at the end to the word solidarity. That's what I mean. Okay, so we have these ups and we downs, but did they?
Well, it's the Ochetuji quote too, right? You do it to keep getting up. You don't do it, you don't focus on the falling down. And so after every failure is the picking yourself back up for the next fight. But what picks you back up is the question. And for me, it's actually, in many ways, it's the power of the repertoire. It's the repetition and knowing that there's something else you can do that at your disposal. So if you get at the end of an indefinite hunger strike, and most the hunger strikes in Korea are indefinite. They don't do a 30-day hunger strike. It's like you do it till you almost die. So after, imagine a 90-day hunger strike, you're going to do something else. You're not at a loss as to what next. So there's the sort of the repetition, I think, gives that the possibility of the next thing. That would be one take I have.
There's also a lot of discussion. Like, I think, there's a lot of workshops that are organized. There's a lot of public conversations, private conversations, a lot of debriefs. So I think what we find is that, like, it's a very reflexive movement. And it could have also been sort of the fact that we were asking our key interlocutors so many questions about this. But like one conversation interview comes to mind, which is Kim Jin. She has the quote about precarious workers. And when we were talking about the different protest forms, there's actually a lot of discussion among non-당사자, non-sort of directly affected, about the utility of these forms. And a lot of them think they're quite futile. So for example, like Ochetuji, very few people want to do that. It's like terrible. Like, I remember when we interviewed the KTX workers, they weren't going to do it, but their religious supporters, multi-faith supporters, had suggested this as the next step, and they were just dreading it, right?
They were starting to train.
They were starting to train. They didn't want to do it, and then Kim Jin, she did a high altitude occupation, but it actually left her with like PTSD, and it was very difficult. That's something that's usually 당사자 led. And she said she doesn't want to do Ochetuji, she doesn't want to do hunger strikes, but she did it because there's also something about the privileged place of 당사자 and the fact that they are the ones risking their bodies and lives, and they're the ones putting them on the line, and so it puts kind of supporters in a different place, both materially and psychologically, and so. I mean, one thing that in some ways, even as we talk, I still think about, Hyunho Park, who's doing research on the Sewol Ferry tragedy. And she's, one question that she often asks us is like, but aren't these kind of protests just simply reproducing the status quo? You know what I mean? Like, what is actually happening? And aren't these movement activists kind of, I don't want to kind of paraphrase, but what I understand is kind of abdicating their responsibility to really push forward a different kind of politics. And I know that I am probably Judy. We sort of resist that because part of it is like, you can have like the best sounding ideological strategy, but as anyone who's part of movements know, like this can fall apart like very easily because of personal conflicts, and so like working together, figuring out how to support each other in conflict, that's what I think this repertoire does. And I think it's that relational practice that actually is what solidarity is about. And maybe when conditions are better, I don't know, that can have an opening and push a little bit further. So I think that is what we wanted to kind of make sense of. Yeah.
You know, when you were talking, you said, keep hope alive. And when I saw that profound quote at the very end, I couldn't help thinking about Jesse Jackson's urging that we keep hope alive. So it's something alive, but we have to keep it alive. Recipes. Other questions? Yes.
I'm really interested in placemaking. The very first example of the altitude occupation process that you illustrated when they just wrapped around everything and they're cleaning up and then went away. But you also mentioned that it is the same space that the candlelight movement can happen. I was just wondering when how does an event such as a protest, whether it be large scale, small scale, emotionally or affectively charge a certain space, and what does not dissipate? What haunts the space? Or is there anything that haunting the space that does not disappear after people have left? Is it because of, you know, how routine, the routine about the Disability Act protest too? Is there something that does not get exercised or, you know, after the cathartic moment that does not get exercised? And if there is, how does it manifest itself in action and emotion or anything like that?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different ways to answer that, but in the candlelight protests, in the rallies, in smaller pockets, we saw a lot of sharing of stories about this is where the previous protests I did XYZ. And you know, for every single one of these like major protest actions that have like a launch, a press conference, it's usually at the same spot. There are participants in these protests who visit these places over and over again, over many decades, for different reasons, and they forge over time. Certainly an emotional investment, and it's very easily you can map where you've been to a protest especially in the downtown area, and I think that sediments over time certainly, and the layers I think can get activated. Are very effective.
Like exploring a part of it so that it can be activated.
Absolutely, yeah, and especially during the candlelight protest, it was like a car-free sort of space, you know, because it was such a mass gathering. People, like our friends, were like, "I can't believe I can walk around like this, and we're not being chased by the police." And this alley we used to run down before XYZ, or that subway entrance we used to duck out of trouble when this and this happened. All of that gets reactivated by relating it to it.
What about altitude-wise, though? Like, because I feel like in point I've been there, but what about altitude?
Altitude, the famous Kim Jin-suk, the construction crane.
Yeah.
Her friend died there 6 years ago, 6 years prior to that. So she was revisiting a gravesite of a former comrade.
So like the forms evoke the memories and the remembering and the commemorations, and then she talks about that when she talks about why she, you know, so, and then that gets kind of shared and carried by the next person. So, you know, I think that kind of connected speech through memory, it's all over.
So I'm getting multiple messages here that unfortunately we are at time, but we have books for sale. But I also want to just check in with you if you have any brief closing remarks. We'd love to hear that.
Oh, we've already talked for so long.
Thank you so much. This really has been such a privilege and a pleasure. And, so great to.
And we can continue the conversation. So still some refreshments back there. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.